You may be surprised to learn that in Ontario's capital city, 1 out of every 6 students requires special education services. For 3.5 decades, those services have supposedly been guaranteed by specific provisions of the Education Act. But how are we truly doing at fulfilling our legal commitments to these students? Let's find out from David Lepofsky, longtime champion for the rights of people with disabilities. He's also chair of the Toronto District School Board's Special Education Advisory Committee, or SEAC. David, welcome. Good to have you back here. And how you doing?
Always delightful to be here.
Terrific. Before we talk about the province of Ontario, let's get the background here and put this in some perspective. Take us back to the middle 1970s in the United States for what I gather you think is the gold standard when it comes to this issue.
In the mid-1970s, the U.S. Congress passed a law governing the entire United States, which guaranteed to every child with a disability the right to a free, appropriate education in the least restrictive environment, and also ensure that there were due process protections so that that right could be effectively implemented. So it's not simply up to each school to decide, nice right, we'll do what we want. And that, while there will be cases to this day where families will argue they're not getting enough, it provided an important framework to ensure that there was education for all kids with disabilities, that effective accommodation is required, and that if you're not getting it, that there's a way to effectively enforce your rights.
And generally speaking, in your view, it works well?
Well, I can't comment on whether certainly advocates of the states would say there's needs for improvement, but the pieces they've got there and that we are missing are pieces that they need and that we need too.
Okay, that's where I want to follow up then. Some years later, I guess 5 or 6 years later in the province of Ontario, we decided to follow suit. What did we come up with?
Well, the Ontario government passed amendments at the start of the 1980s to the Education Act and then some regulations to implement them. But they are an extremely pale shadow of what was passed in the states. They do seek to ensure education for all kids of all abilities, but they principally just leave it up to school boards to decide how much, how little, when, and so on. They provide very narrow appeal rights to parents. Parents can only have a formal hearing to discuss what their child's placement is, but not the programs or services that they will receive in that placement.
Let's just pick that apart a bit. What's so bad about leaving it up to the school boards to do this?
Well, the point is this. It's important when you have a fundamental right like this. This is a human right. It's guaranteed by the Human Rights Code. Every person has a right to equal treatment without discrimination because of disability, and that includes a duty to accommodate students with disabilities. Now, the problem is that our school system has been designed for decades on a false and unfair premise. Back in the 70s and afterwards, it was based on the idea that there are two kinds of students. Normal students, they don't use that word anymore, but they did for years, and then exceptional students. Normal students are the ones for which schools are built, teachers are trained, curriculum are designed, gym equipment is bought, and so on. Everybody else is an exceptional student. If you can't benefit from a system of education that wasn't designed for you, if you have a disability so that you can't get into school or can't read the books or don't learn the way others do, then you're considered an exception. And then you get what's called special education. Even the terminology is in some ways pejorative and troubling.
Can I just understand this, though? Exceptional, when you use that word, I don't know, in my head, when I hear exceptional, I think unusually good. That's not what they mean?
Well, oddly, it actually covers both those who are super bright, gifted kids, and those kids with a physical, mental, sensory, intellectual, or learning disability who are not part of this bogus paradigm of, quote, normal. Now, again, they don't use the word normal, but they do use the word exception and exceptionality and so on. So the problem is that for years, our schools were built, our programs were designed to only meet the needs of the mainstream. The other kids had to do a rearguard battle to get in, and so they need school education accommodation. But the accommodations they get are a committee that can only decide on placement. It can only make recommendations which are not appealable and no one needs to follow on program or services. There are narrow appeal rights from there. And 10 years ago, the Human Rights Commission said that this system is too sluggish, It grinds parents down, and it's not effective and fair. Similarly, and it's the regulations which were passed more recently provide that schools have to provide each special education student with what's called an individual education plan. Now, that's a good idea, but it's totally up to the school what they give you or don't give you. And if you don't like what you get, your only legal recourse is to go file a human rights complaint against the school board, go to the Human Rights Tribunal, and battle the very school board that is there to meet your child's needs.
And presumably that costs a lot of money.
Well, it costs you a lot of money, and the school board dips into the taxpayer's pocket to pay for lawyers to throw at you.
So if you don't like the kind of individual educational program that the school board has come up with, at the moment, you've got this enormous mountain to climb to appeal. What would you prefer to see?
Well, 10 years ago, the Human Rights Commission itself, in a groundbreaking report after a sweeping consultation on the barriers facing kids with disabilities, said this. First, they said, we've got a school system that is full of barriers that impede kids with disabilities. Now, that's not to say no kids are getting anything. It's just it's an uphill battle. And it said, the Human Rights Commission said that we need to put in place a new, fair, expeditious, and effective process for school boards to resolve issues if there is a disagreement over what accommodations will be provided. And it should be fair, and it should provide for some appropriate independent checks.
You know what, you take a swig of water, and I'm going to put some numbers up here in the meantime, because for those who think that we're not talking about very many people here, we actually are. If you look at the total numbers, we've got 240,000 students in total in the Toronto District School Board, and fully 43,000 require special education services. That's 1 in 6. We're talking about a lot of people here, David.
We're absolutely talking about a lot of people, and here's the thing that's especially important. To the government's credit, 11 years ago, the Ontario legislature unanimously passed the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. I had the privilege of leading the campaign for that legislation, and I have the privilege now of leading the campaign to try to get it effectively enforced. It requires Ontario to become fully accessible by 2025. And by accessible, we don't just mean ramps instead of stairs. We mean accessible for people with disabilities, whether it's blindness, which is my disability, or hearing loss, or a sensory disability, intellectual disability, learning disabilities, and so on. Well, part of that is a requirement for the Ontario government to lead our education system to become fully accessible by 2025. Well, we have no plan in place right now, no provincially led plan to ensure that we get there. For that reason, the broad cross-disability provincial coalition I have the privilege of leading, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, we've been campaigning for more than a half a decade to get the Ontario government to agree to develop and enact an education accessibility standard. It would be a blueprint. It would tell school boards what they got to do and when they got to do it by. It would avoid the need for each school board to reinvent the accessibility wheel, which is the plight we're in right now.
Mm-hmm. But we don't have this yet. So let me ask you about where things are at today, insofar as, if I understand this properly, every school board in Ontario has to have a SEAC, a Special Education Advisory Committee.
Every publicly funded school board.
Publicly funded school board. Okay, and you are the chair of the Toronto District School Board's SEAC.
That's correct.
So what are you're in the position of having to advise the school board on all of these issues, right?
Right. So what we are doing, and our committee is made up of fabulous folks from various disability organizations and parents of kids with special needs. And what we're doing right now is we've set some core priorities. The first is basically saying, what do parents get told about what's available? What are the options for their kids? And how open and fair is the process for decisions to be made? Now, these are issues that would be relevant to any school board, but we're looking at the Toronto District School Board. And what could be done to improve this.
Can you give us a for instance? Like what kinds of things do you tell them they need to do?
Well, we're just in the middle of reaching out and trying to figure this out. But one of the very first things we've come to realize, and we're going to be doing parents outreach to get more on this, but what we've come to realize is right now, if you're a parent watching this program, you've got a kid in the Toronto District School Board, and you just want to find out what the educational options are for your child who may have special education needs, it's really hard to find out. I describe the TDSB as like a restaurant that either has no menu or doesn't want to give it to you. And so,
well, don't they have a website where you can get all this info?
But we're looking at that website because it doesn't make it easy to find, and it's left up to each individual principal in over 500 schools. And we'd like to make sure that there's a more effective way for parents just to find out the basics of what's available. Once they find out what's available, if they want to advocate for what their child needs, if they work out an arrangement that works, that's fantastic, and of course some do. For those who don't, we want to look at the possibility of what kind of ways the Toronto District School Board could come up with its own internal, fair, expeditious process for trying to sort these issues out so parents don't have to resort to lawyers and the Human Rights Tribunal.
Would you have any idea, we mentioned earlier 43,000 students in Toronto alone requiring special education services. Would you have any sense about what percentage of that 43,000 are, in your view, well served?
Okay, we're not in a position to say that. I just became the chair. I just got on this committee a year ago and just became its chair a month ago. So we've got a lot of work ahead. But what we do know is this: there are, broadly speaking, two general options. Lots of opportunities between the two. One of which is placing the child in a mainstream classroom with appropriate supports, and the other is placing them in a segregated or special education class. We know that the provincial data that we were given a year ago at a provincial conference says that the overall average across Ontario for kids with special needs is that 85% are in the mainstream, 15% are in a segregated
Do you like that
setting.
ratio?
Well, let me just tell you about Toronto.
Okay.
Toronto, it's 50-50. So there's a huge disparity. Now, what we don't know, and what we're going to be asking TDSB to look into, is why. Now, it could be that the province-wide data includes placing kids in a mainstream setting, but maybe without the appropriate supports. I can't say one's absolutely right and one's absolutely wrong.
Gotcha.
This needs some serious looking at, because it's not just a question of including a kid in the mainstream, saying, open the door, say, okay, kid, this class wasn't planned for you, the building wasn't designed for you, the teacher wasn't trained for you, have a good time. You got to make sure that they have the appropriate supports. One of the things that we're focusing on immediately in Toronto is this. We've learned in January that there is anticipated to be a $3 million cut in provincial funding for what's called the high needs amount or whatever. They've got all these budget formula terms. But anyway, it's a $3 million cut, we're advised by TDSB officials, to the special ed budget for this upcoming year. And what the committee I chair, the Special Education Advisory Committee, is mandated by regulations to advise on the special education budget. And so what we've done is we've passed a resolution which we are directing to the board, the school board, and we're asking to appear before the school board to present this, which is our right, saying do not cut direct teaching positions, don't cut any staff positions that either provide direct service to these children or the direct supervisors. There's lots of other places to look in the board. The basic message we're conveying is the last place you should be cutting is from the most vulnerable, disadvantaged, and underserved students in the school board,
Sure, but
whatever be the reason for their disadvantage.
Your job, though, is to advise. Their job is to decide. So the fact that you give the advice doesn't mean they have to follow it, does it?
That's one of the reasons that our special education legislation is so weak. It provides parents very limited rights through the school board process, and it gives us very limited oversight mandate as a special education advisory committee. Now, we're going to do what we can to bring our message forward as loud and clear as we can. I've already presented it to the budget committee of the school board. And as I said, we've asked to be able to present to the entire board, which is our right under regulations. We'd like to get our oar in there before decisions are made, not just be there afterwards to say, hey, that wasn't such a good thing to do.
Gotcha. Let me ask you about something that we talked about just before we went on the air together, and that is that supposedly in the province of Ontario today, when you build something new, it's supposed to be with a thought in mind to having it being accessible to people with disabilities. Am I okay so far?
That's the common belief. Unfortunately, it's just not true.
So tell me about you. You're a former law prof at Osgoode Hall, eh?
I am now on the part-time visiting professor at the Osgoode Hall Law School starting this year.
Up at York University.
Yeah, and just as one illustration, I don't want to pick on Osgoode. It's a fabulous place to work, and the students are great, and it's a great place to learn. But this is an illustration of the problem which is replicated in other places as well. And that is this. People think old buildings, they're going to be more inaccessible. New buildings, we've got it right, don't worry. And the government reinforces this mythology by their claims that they've done a good job of improving our building code. The problem is this. The law school I went to, which was Osgoode Hall Law School, I went to 40 years ago, and it wasn't great on wheelchair access, no question. But for a blind person to learn their way around, it took me about an hour the first time, and I could bomb around the school on my own, no problem. They did a major renovation in the past few years, which included, I'm told, some government money. Premier Wynne has promised the government money would never be used to create barriers against people with disabilities. Well, unfortunately, this renovation, I mean, the good news is the renovation did a really good job of improving wheelchair access, but it has turned this building, not the wheelchair access, but the way they did the renovation has actually made it one of the worst buildings I've ever tried to navigate as a blind person. Just as one example, there's a main hallway on the ground floor, or on the main floor, and we blind people are trained to follow the side of a main hallway with our cane. It's called shorelining. One side of that hall is all soft seating, so I'd have to slalom around students and whack their shins. Not such a good idea. But the other length of the hallway, every couple of meters, has a pillar, and it's an angled pillar. So your cane goes under it and says it's safe to walk, and then your head whacks into it.
So it's a pillar angled to lean in.
Yeah, and I'm told there's some sighted folks who've also whacked their head if they're looking at their smartphone or whatever. But these are not structural. They're empty, hollow metal. They're simply for design. If there are any architects watching this show, my advice to you is if you're giving advice to anybody in the future, angled pillars, they may look pretty, but please don't do this.
Interesting.
My message to the Wynne government is, among the ways that you need to tackle our built environment and the barriers we face is to ensure that we have really strong requirements for new buildings to be fully accessible, because we don't right now.
David, let's finish up on this. The Premier, of course, is a former education minister and was widely thought to be one of the better ones in Ontario history. So clearly she knows about this. How confident are you that she is as seized of it as she needs to be?
Well, I think Kathleen Wynne wants to do a good job on accessibility. I think, personally, she cares about this. The problem is she's not doing what needs to be done. A year ago, just after I was on your show the last time, an independent review of our Disabilities Act was released that said we're not on schedule for full accessibility. Our Disabilities Act has not made a significant job in 10 years in the lives of people with disabilities, and the Premier needs to show new leadership. Unfortunately, on the issue of education accessibility, it's been more than half a decade of us saying, could you please direct the creation of an education accessibility standard? It's something the Premier could be really proud of, but they're still kind of messing around rather than coming up with a decision on this. They haven't said no, they just won't say yes. A year ago, they said they would develop a healthcare accessibility standard, but they haven't done a single thing to start the legislative process that the Disabilities Act requires to get that standard underway. We just don't have this kind of time. So we're actually releasing an action kit calling on voters right across the province. This is my Disability Coalition, not the Toronto School Board Committee, urging folks from any political party to urge their members of the legislature to press for more action on accessibility, including pressing for the government to agree to develop an education accessibility standard. It's something we need, and it's something that all Ontarians could be truly proud of.
David, as always, we thank you for your visit here to TVO. We also want to remind people, particularly those who are visually impaired and can't see the supers that we will have put up on the screen, that they can get more information about this at www.aodaalliance.org, or they can follow you on Twitter at David Lepofsky.
And if you're in Toronto, in the Toronto District School Board, our Special Education Advisory Committee would love to hear what your experiences are. We can't give you advice. We can listen to your experience. Just send us an email to seacfeedback, S-E-A-C feedback, at gmail.com. Just tell us what your experiences are, good, bad, whatever they are. We want to hear about it, what your experiences are with special education and what more you think could be done to ensure that our school board serves everybody and does it well.
Great. David, many thanks.
Thanks so much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.